नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत् नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत् नमस्ते देवदेवेश चङ्गचक्रगदाधर नमस्ते देवदेवेश चङ्गचक्रगदाधर भक्तेच्छोभक्त्यरूपाय परमात्मन् नमोऽस्तु ते भक्तेच्छोभक्तरूपाय परमात्मन् नमोऽस्तु ते नमः पङ्कजनाभाय नमः पङ्कजमालिने नमः पङ्कजनाभाय नमः पङ्कजमालिने नमः पङ्कजनेत्राय नमः पङ्कजाङ्ग्रये नमः पङ्कजनेत्राय नमः पङ्कजाङ्ग्रये नमो भगवते तुभ्यं वासुदेवाय विष्णवे नमो भगवते तुभ्यं वासुदेवाय विष्णवे पुरुषाय आदिबीजाय पूर्णबोधाय ते नमः पुरुषाय आदिबीजाय पूर्णबोधाय ते नमः.
I'm now speaking with Dr. Anand Venkatkrishnan, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Oxford University, College of Balliol. He's been studying the Bhagavata Purāṇa at Columbia University and now is continuing his work there at Oxford University. He is part of our center, the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. Can you tell us what is the Bhagavata Purāṇa? Let's start with basics.
Sure. The Bhagavata Purāṇa is a genre of Hindu scriptural texts called a Purāṇa, of which there are several, 18 major ones and several minor ones. The Bhagavata is one of the most well-known today. It's a very lengthy text in the Sanskrit language with several hundreds, even thousands of verses. Mostly it's about the life of the god Krishna. It deals with his life in a narrative fashion. It tells stories about him. It is philosophical, dealing with what the god Krishna's real identity might be. And it's devotional. It encourages a sense of emotional attachment to this very, very beautiful, visually entrancing god, Krishna.
What would you say is giving the Bhagavata Purāṇa such popularity, not only in earlier times, which you have been studying, but continuing over the time from whenever it was completed, more than 1,000 years ago, presumably, up to the present?
Well, the Bhagavata is an interesting confluence of a number of different trends and languages and traditions within the broad kind of religion of Hinduism. It incorporates Sanskrit, philosophical and devotional traditions. It also incorporates Tamil poetry that was local to the Tamil country. Although the language itself is in Sanskrit, which tends to be a little bit inaccessible to, especially in other scriptural traditions, the Bhagavata's own Sanskrit is extremely rich, literary, and enchanting in and of itself. So the text itself was very attractive, even in its early composition. It really styled itself as a very literary and rich sort of text. At the same time, the Bhagavata wasn't just a text. It was performed. It was always orally recited and rendered. The Bhagavata was translated into several Indian vernacular languages. But in addition to translation, many of the stories that are contained in the Bhagavata formed the cornerstone of various networks of devotional poetry, or what we call bhakti poetry, throughout the Indian subcontinent. So that centered largely around the life of Krishna. His mischievous pranks as a little boy, his loving kind of escapades as an adolescent, and even his sort of his grand stature as a philosophical exemplar, like that presented in the Bhagavad Gita. All of these identities of Krishna are encapsulated in the Bhagavata, and they are then sort of taken up for a great deal of, they become the object of interest for a number of different devotional groups, religious communities, spanning the Indian subcontinent and for the next few centuries after the text's own composition. So its ability to straddle a number of lines, philosophical, religious, literary, language, all of these things combine to make the Bhagavata extremely popular throughout the second millennium, especially in India. Its story abroad is a different question, but that's a slightly different.
And one of the dimensions of the Bhagavata is the commentarial tradition. The fact that so many of the Sanskrit learned clergy, we might say, and philosophers, theologians have commented in Sanskrit on the text. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, commentary was extremely important to the explication of religious texts, scriptures, preceding the Bhagavata, like the Upanishads, like the Bhagavad Gita. These formed an important part of the formation of particular philosophical communities, some of which were associated with temple cultures and so on. The Bhagavata was commented upon verse by verse by many different people who belonged to different schools of interpretation. One of the earliest extant commentaries that we have was by a man named Sridhara. This was in approximately the 14th and 15th centuries. And he gave his own particular interpretation of the Bhagavata. Sridhara's commentary became extremely popular, and it influenced a great deal of commentaries up and down the subcontinent, but was modified and changed according to the needs of various different religious communities. For example, what we now today know as the Vallabha Sampradaya, a particular religious community in North and Northwest India, the founder and the early authors and leaders of this community wrote their own commentaries on the Bhagavata, influenced by Sridhara but taking it in different directions. The same was the case with a group of Bengalis who were inspired by the text that followed the charismatic religious leader Chaitanya. His followers, many of them, wrote commentaries of their own. All of these were in the language Sanskrit, but all of them gave different philosophical interpretations of what the true content of the Bhagavata really was. But the commentarial tradition wasn't restricted to the communities that I've mentioned, which were largely what we would call Vaishnava in character, that is to say that they were religious communities devoted to the worship of the god Vishnu. The Bhagavata inspired writers and philosophers who were primarily trained in the Shaiva traditions of Shiva religion, especially in southern India. And some of my current work, sort of examines some of those commentaries, but that's relatively new, relatively unstudied. So.
What would intrigue me with connection to that is, as you know, in the 4th book of the Bhagavata is the story of Shiva being confronted by Daksha, in which Shiva, as the yogi, is the source of great anger by Daksha, and this leads to quite some conflict between them. I would be curious what the Shaivites say about that particular episode, which is representing Shiva. It seems to me within the text he's represented as a Vishnu bhakta.
Yeah.
What can you say something about?
Yeah, absolutely. At the same time that there are passages in the Bhagavata in which the god Shiva is subordinated to the god Vishnu, in the 8th chapter, for example, there is an entire passage in which Shiva is equated with the supreme god head, in which Krishna is elsewhere in the text. There's a great deal of influence from early Shaivism within the Bhagavata itself.
So, Vaishnavism and Shaivism. Vaishnavism, the worship of Vishnu; Shaivism, the worship of Shiva as supreme divinities, are usually seen as distinct traditions, distinct theologies. Is it that the Bhagavatam is doing something not so clear-cut as these distinctions generally are presented as?
Well, the Bhagavata is generally seen as a primarily Vaishnava text, and for good reason. Vishnu is, in his incarnation as Krishna, is central to the Bhagavata's own theology. At the same time, the Bhagavata does seem to show a great deal of influence from early Shaiva religious traditions and texts. For example, some of what we see as distinct features of bhakti in the Bhagavata, that is to say, bhakti meaning emotional love for a visually entrancing God. Some of these very physical features of bhakti, such as hair standing on end, tears rolling down one's cheeks, eyes welling up with the sense of anticipation,
the symptoms of the experience of emotions in relation to the Lord.
Right, these symptoms of bhakti or emotional love for God, which we consider distinct to the Bhagavata, feature in some early Shaiva texts when thinking about what a yogi, that is to say, an ascetic, mostly solitary meditator, experiences when he encounters his goal of absorption in the divine.
Okay, although I think Mircea Eliade would say that yogis' experience is not ecstasy so much as ecstasy.
Indeed,
the internal experience as opposed to external.
Right. Well, one of the things the Bhagavata does is again play with this distinction between the yogi and the devotee. Sometimes the yogi, as the kind of solitary ascetic, is presented as unable to access the unique devotional and emotional experience of the bhakta or the devotee. But at the same time that they are distinguished, their experiences are equated in some passages in the Bhagavata. So we see, again, the Bhagavata as a confluence of a number of different religious traditions, number of different practices, a number of different religious practices that feature in different traditions, Shaiva and Vaishnava both, in India.
Regarding the philosophy or theology of Bhagavata Purāṇa, it's often said that the Bhagavata philosophy theology is quite unsystematic. And I wonder if the Bhagavatas, if we want to accept that idea, if that's an indication of the text being a transitional text in terms of its ideas, or is there some other way of explaining it that you find useful?
I think that the Bhagavata is a coherent work It does present a very distinct vision of Krishna as the supreme divinity. At the same time, the way in which it encounters Krishna is extremely different throughout the text. Sometimes Krishna is equated with an absolute, undifferentiated, supreme essence that underlies all of existence. And at other times, he's seen as a child, somebody who's physically very present, somebody who's an adolescent, somebody whom you can encounter every day. And the Bhagavata holds both of these together. So inasmuch as it presents different ways of encountering Krishna, it is transitional, or it is contradictory sometimes, or it is unsystematic. But it is nevertheless centered around this very, very interesting figure.
And in that sense, it is unitive, and therefore not just unsystematic.
Indeed, it tries to bring together a number of different
Right.
Perspectives.
And is that not also a sense, in a sense, what the Bhagavata is about in terms of inclusiveness of audience? That it is attracting, because this is our question, why is the Bhagavata interesting for people? It seems to be inclusive in that sense also.
To a great extent, yes, at least in comparison to some of the Sanskrit text traditions that it inherits, such as the Upanishads. It presents itself as accessible to a wider range of audiences than the mainstream texts of the Brahmin elite, let's say. Women, members of non-Brahmin castes. It is not surprising then that it is taken up for, like I said before, translation and rendering in vernacular poetry by a wide range of communities throughout the subcontinent. So even though the text itself is written in a language that is generally inaccessible except to elite educated audiences, in its performance it was intended to be accessible to a wide range of communities and people.
And speaking of that point, moving more to the present, I know you're a historian, but moving to the present, could you say something about how the text has migrated beyond South Asia and why it might be of interest to persons beyond South Asia?
The story of the Bhagavata's migration outside of India is twofold, actually. Early European scholars of Indian religion and literature were very interested in the Bhagavata. It was one of the earliest Indian texts to actually be translated into European language. But that was largely at the scholarly level. At the more popular, let's say, religious or devotional level, the Bhagavata became central to many people's view of Hinduism in general, largely from the mid-20th century onwards, with the migration of several teachers from India to the West, including but not limited to Swami Prabhupada, who was the founder of the modern ISKCON movement. Why the Bhagavata might be interesting to people today, in my opinion, it's because of its extremely literary quality. Sanskrit is a language that is very difficult to learn. Its grammar is extremely complex. Sometimes it feels very frustrating and sometimes inaccessible. But encountering the Bhagavata is one primarily encounters it as an extremely enchanting poem. And it was intended to be equivalent to the tradition of, let's say, belles lettres or elite, frequently secular literature that had developed in Sanskrit for a few centuries prior to the Bhagavata. So its extremely poetic and literary quality is one of the attractive things about it that I think is something that would appeal to not only students of Sanskrit, but people who are interested in the intersection between religion and literature today.
Right. So the reception history, as scholars like to call it, of the text is an ongoing process, we can say.
Very much so. The people who are continuing to engage with not only the ideas of the Bhagavata, but also the language of the Bhagavata, span a number of different communities.
So does this mean more people are going to start learning Sanskrit just to read the Bhagavata?
If that happens, I'd be happy.
Can we know something about what got you into this particular study of this particular text, the Bhagavata?
Well, my background is as a classicist. I studied Greek and Latin, but prior to that I studied Sanskrit as a child.
Oh.
Kind of re-encountering the Sanskrit through my training as a historian of literature, I wanted to pursue that in further studies. I was primarily, in my childhood, I had received a significant cultural background in Indian religion and philosophy, and I began by studying the history of Indian philosophy. At the same time, a lot of the people that I was studying, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries where my research is concentrated, in addition to writing significant and voluminous works on these traditions of Indian philosophy, they were extremely, in their personal lives, interested in the Bhagavata Purāṇa. And so I started seeing this connection as a part of a broader trend of the relationship between religion as lived affect, as part of one's emotional life, and philosophy as intellectual practice. And that's where my research interests directed me, and so that's how I began my study of the Bhagavata.
So it became a very perfect sort of confluence of interests. On the one side, the philosophical interests and history of philosophy, and on the other, as you say, the experience of affect, that some of those subjects you were reading in philosophy, maybe they go to their office and do their philosophy, they go home and they read the Bhagavata.
Yeah, in fact, they don't just go home, they explain it to other people and they tell stories.
Yeah.
So I started finding out more about people who were both scholars and storytellers, or sermonizers in a way.
Yeah.
And so studying their history became part of my research interests. Yeah. Yeah, sure. I mean,
or maybe something you can say that the motif is typically sages teaching kings, and what that dynamic is, or why that is traditional in Indian literature.
The motif of the frame of the Bhagavata, in which a sage teaches a king, tells him the story of Krishna. That motif is quite old in Indian literature, from the Mahabharata, the famous Indian epic, and even in the Upanishads, we have narratives of sages teaching kings, but sometimes the reverse. The kinds of stories that are told in the Bhagavata vary significantly. Some of the most popular, however, center around the exploits of Krishna. But there's much more than that. There are many digressions in which we have the stories of, animals included. Animals have their own lives in the Bhagavata, and we're told a lot about them.
The elephant.
For example, the elephant king Gajendra, who is saved by Lord Vishnu when he calls out to him. So there are several different kinds of stories in the Bhagavata, but primarily they center around encouraging devotion and encouraging attachment to this very unique divinity.
We find this notion of bhakti is also analyzed. I'm thinking of the very first book, chapter 2 is essentially a chapter about bhakti and the efficacy, the results of practicing bhakti. There seems to be a strong sense in the Bhagavata that here is something to be learned, and that it's something to be learned that will bring a certain result, and that result doesn't seem to be so much moksha or liberation. Generally, isn't it, that Indian philosophy is all about liberation, and yet the Bhagavata seems to be saying, well, liberation comes as a side benefit to is that your understanding?
I think both understandings are possible. The Bhagavata is very insistent that bhakti is the singular means to liberation. In fact, the most efficacious means to liberation. And so it does, at very significant places, hold liberation as an ideal. For example, there's the story of Ajamila, who was a sort of dissolute man who, at the very end of his life, simply calls out to his son, whose name, Narayana, is the same name as one of the names of Vishnu. As a result, because he simply recites God's name at his death, he is given liberation. So that is seen as a very important and valued goal. But at the same time, the emphasis of the stories is on the power of bhakti itself, and why it contributes to a fulfilled human life.
It seems to me, again, thinking of the present, the notion of liberation doesn't seem like a really exciting notion to most people today. Even people who maybe practice some sort of yoga, and they may know about the idea of liberation, but you say, you know, do this and you'll get liberated. What does that mean? Who cares? They want something else.
One could say that the Bhagavata very much encourages life in the world. It is a religion of, it encourages a religion of sort of the everyday, and sort of turning one's mind to God in the everyday. So rather than emphasizing something that is otherworldly or that is something to be reached eventually. These are presented as ideals, no doubt, but the practices that the Bhagavata encourages are very much centered in everyday life.
And would you say that people see such practices as, okay, this is something I could do also?
I think the Bhagavata presents itself as such, that this is something that anybody can do, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from.
Whether 1,000 years ago or today. What do we actually understand by the term liberation in general, but perhaps more specifically in the Bhagavata?
Classically speaking, the term liberation meant liberation from the finite bonds of everyday existence. This is a term that was very important to early Buddhism and Jainism, traditions that emphasized that the world was primarily, and life in the world was primarily comprised of suffering, from birth to old age to death, and that this was repeated over and over. Samsara. This cycle and this endless cycle was seen as something extremely negative and something that one should strive to be free of. Hence the term liberation, to be free from this cycle of birth and death. In this vision, life in the world is seen as something that is extremely difficult, negative, repetitive, absurd. In the Bhagavata, however, there is a more positive twist given to liberation, where liberation for some could be the ideal of removing oneself and removing oneself from the finite and the embodied, and identifying oneself with kind of the supreme or the ultimate nature of existence. Something that is a little bit inaccessible, something that is a little bit cold at first blush. The Bhagavata, however, also presents a view of liberation that is not so much removing oneself and dissolving oneself, but rather attaining unity with one's beloved. And God here is seen as one's beloved rather than something that is cold and formless. So the Bhagavata's view of liberation is a little bit more, let's say, positive, a little bit more affirmative than its previous incarnations.
When you say unity, do you mean absolute non-difference, or are you saying togetherness with some distinction?
That depends on whom you ask. Different commentators and different interpreters of the Bhagavata have seen that ideal differently. So.
Right.
One of my teacher's teachers once called the Bhagavata, especially in its 10th book, the most enchanting poem ever written.
We've already heard that.
Okay.
That was Professor Daniel Ingalls.
That was
it?
Daniel Ingalls.
Yes.
And so I would second that. If it makes anybody learn Sanskrit, then
Very good. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay,
indeed.
thank you. Thank you so much.